Why do some men fall like puppets at the feet of powerful women, while others stand untouched, unmoved, almost untouchable? What if the reason isn't strength of body, but strength of psyche? In this story, we unlock the psychological arsenal of one such man, Carl Jung, the man women couldn't control. And more importantly, we'll show you how to build that same power. What makes a man untouchable? Really? Not in the way people pretend to be strong, but in the way they actually are. Carl Jung's power came from something few dare to cultivate: psychological sovereignty. He didn't just study the mind, he mastered his own. While others craved validation, attention, admiration, he chose awareness. This wasn't coldness, it was clarity. When you no longer need to be loved, you become impossible to manipulate. Women couldn't control Jung because there was no weakness in him to exploit. No emotional leash to pull, no hidden thirst for approval. And isn't that what control always feeds on? Desire. But Jung wasn't starving. In fact, he was full of insight, purpose, internal gravity. He understood the mechanics of the psyche so deeply, even charm became predictable. Influence, visible. Attraction, manageable. Look at the world today. Look at men driven mad by silence, ghosting, rejection. Men who crumble when affection is withheld. Jung wouldn't have flinched. He wouldn't have begged. Why? Because he didn't trade his soul for attention. He cultivated it in solitude. A who looks outside dreams. Jung once said, "A who looks inside awakens." And awakening is dangerous, to some even offensive. Because an awakened man doesn't chase, he chooses. He isn't swayed by flattery or pressure. He observes, he deciphers, he decides. Think of Marcus Aurelius alone in a Roman palace, surrounded by politics and power plays, but grounded in inner discipline. Think of Miyamoto Musashi, wandering the mountains after defeating every opponent, choosing a life of principle over pleasure. Jung stood among them, in a different age, but with the same flame. The power of self-command. The inner steel that makes emotional storms irrelevant. Imagine sitting across from someone who cannot be baited, who hears praise and hears criticism, and gives both the same smile. That was Jung. Not because he was detached from humanity, but because he was rooted deeper in it than most can fathom. Women were drawn to him, but they couldn't move him, not because he didn't feel, but because he didn't need. And that, right there, is the foundation of unshakable power. When your identity isn't built in someone else's mirror, when your validation isn't borrowed, you become dangerous. Not violent, sovereign, not aloof, anchored. And in a world that thrives on control, sovereignty is the ultimate rebellion. What happens when a man dares to meet the woman inside his own mind, before he meets her in the world? Carl Jung knew the answer. He called it the Anima, the unconscious feminine that lives within every man. And this wasn't poetic nonsense. It was a weapon of perception, a gateway to control not over others, but over self. You see, most men are blind to this force. They feel drawn to beauty, tenderness, mystery, but they don't understand why. They call it love. They chase it. They collapse under it. But Jung saw the architecture behind it all. He saw how a man projects his unacknowledged femininity onto a woman, thinking she completes him, thinking she is his missing piece. But what if that feeling was just a reflection of your own unknown depths? Jung didn't romanticize this dynamic. He dissected it. He studied it. And because he understood it, he wasn't ruled by it. He didn't fall victim to his own projections. He reclaimed them. That's why women couldn't dominate him, because he had already made peace with his Anima. He didn't search for her in others. He integrated her in himself. And integration, that's the key. It means a man no longer confuses attraction with destiny, no longer mistakes longing for love, no longer surrenders to the illusion that someone else can give him what he hasn't found in himself. And isn't that what breaks most men? They love too fast, obsess too deep, lose themselves completely. They call it passion, but it's possession. They fall for women who are simply mirrors of what they refuse to face. Jung shattered that mirror. He went into the shadow, into the chaos, and came back whole. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And how many men today still call it fate? Still blame the woman. Still blame the heartbreak. Still live as victims of an inner war they refuse to fight. But not Jung. He fought. He faced the feminine not in her, but in himself. That's why he couldn't be seduced into surrender. He had already surrendered to truth. And when you own your inner feminine, you don't need it from anyone else. You stop seeking softness because you've found your own. You stop chasing care because you've cultivated your own. And the one who no longer chases can never be controlled. How do you control someone who has already let go? You don't. And that, right there, is why Carl Jung was untouchable. Not because he resisted control, but because he had nothing to grip, nothing to manipulate, nothing to lose. Detachment doesn't mean indifference. It means freedom. And freedom terrifies those who seek to dominate. Jung didn't run from emotions. He witnessed them. He didn't suppress desire. He observed it. He didn't hate power. He transcended the need to prove it. And that's what made him dangerous in the most elegant way. He didn't rebel. He rose. People often confuse reaction with strength. They think anger is power. They think silence is weakness. But Jung knew, true control begins when reaction ends. You cannot be played if you do not perform. You cannot be manipulated if you do not respond. That's not cold. That's clarity. Women couldn't control him not because he didn't care, but because he cared more about his truth than their approval. Think about that. Most men shatter when love is withheld. Most men bend when affection becomes conditional. Most men conform when presence becomes a reward. But Jung, he stood still. He watched. He waited. He chose. And that unsettled everything. Detachment is not escape. It's engagement without addiction. Imagine being in a storm and knowing you're not the wind, not the rain, not the thunder, but the sky, unmoved, vast, untouched. That's what Jung practiced. That's what made him sovereign. He didn't need to possess anyone because he wasn't possessed by his own hunger. And that's rare. That's rare in a world where most chase connection to escape themselves, where most run from loneliness and call it love. But Jung embraced solitude. He didn't drown in it. He studied it. He used it. He forged himself in it. He understood what most ignore, that the one who cannot sit with himself will always chase someone who distracts him from himself. And control thrives in that chase. But he wasn't chasing. He had already arrived. And when a man arrives in himself, really arrives, he becomes ungovernable. Not rude, not arrogant, just immune. Immune to the flattery. Immune to the withdrawal. Immune to the patterns that trap ordinary men. Carl Jung was not tamed because he was already whole. And what is there to hold over a man who does not crave what you can offer? What leash can you tie around someone who has already untied himself from the need to be chosen? That's not rebellion. That's enlightenment. Why do some men collapse at a whisper, while others remain unshaken in the middle of chaos? Why do some lose their soul over a glance, while others keep their throne even when love walks away? The answer isn't charm. It isn't toughness. It's depth. And Carl Jung, he didn't swim in shallow waters. He lived in the abyss by choice. He understood that true power isn't loud. It's silent. It doesn't boast. It builds. Jung didn't rise through dominance. He rose through descent. Descent into the unconscious. Descent into the parts of himself that most men avoid. You see, depth is dangerous. It costs comfort. It costs illusion. It costs the sweet lies you tell yourself to keep from facing the truth. Most men want peace, but they run from the war within. Jung walked straight into it. That's why nothing external could overthrow him. He had already seen the worst of himself and survived. He had already wrestled the dark, and rather than deny it, he brought it to the table. "I'd rather be whole than good," he said. And that's the essence of depth. Not perfection, not purity, but power through integration. And integrated men, they don't get controlled. They command, not with noise, but with gravity, with weight, with presence. Jung's presence came from his refusal to stay at the surface. He didn't talk about ideas to impress. He didn't quote psychology to seduce. He didn't use knowledge to dominate others. He used it to dismantle himself. To break the false layers. To expose the parts that flinch. And because he did that, no one could use those parts against him. Women couldn't trap him with flattery. Because he saw the strings behind the smile. They couldn't crush him with silence. Because he had already made peace with emptiness. They couldn't manipulate him with affection. Because he had already faced the parts of him that longed for it. Think about that. Think of how many men are led by unseen needs. The need to be wanted. The need to be admired. The need to feel like a man. Jung didn't reject those needs. He questioned them. And questioning is where power begins. When you start asking, why do I want this? Why do I need her attention? Why do I feel small when I'm alone? You begin to dig. And digging creates depth. Not the kind that looks impressive, but the kind that makes you immovable. Women, especially powerful women, can feel that depth. Not just intellectually, but viscerally. They test it. They press against it. They want to see if the structure holds. And when it does, when a man does not flinch, does not fold, does not perform for approval, they can't touch him. Not because he's above them, but because he's beneath the surface, rooted too deeply to sway. Jung's work with dreams, with archetypes, with symbols, wasn't just theory. It was survival. It was sovereignty. He decoded the language of the unconscious, not just to treat others, but to free himself. He saw how culture programs men to seek outside what they fear to build inside. How society rewards shallowness with attention and punishes depth with isolation. But he chose depth anyway. He walked away from applause to find alignment. He let go of validation to find vision. And that vision made him powerful. Because vision clears illusion. An illusion is the foundation of control. Most men are tricked not by women, but by their own fantasies. Fantasies about what love should feel like. Fantasies about being chosen. Fantasies about being enough. Jung tore those fantasies down, not with hatred, not with anger, but with awareness, with silence, with the kind of inner dialogue that doesn't flatter, but frees. The kind that asks, what part of me still craves permission to exist? Because until you answer that, you can be owned. By a compliment, by a kiss, by a promise. But once you know where that craving comes from, you cut the puppet strings, and then you move through the world with stillness. The kind of stillness that makes people nervous. Because they can't figure out what you want. They can't bait you. They can't tame you. And that's the paradox. When you stop needing control, you become uncontrollable. Carl Jung embodied that paradox. He knew the feminine. He honored it. But he didn't submit to it. He loved, but he wasn't lost. He gave, but he wasn't emptied. He connected, but he never disconnected from himself. And in that balance, in that terrifying, sacred balance, he became the man women couldn't control. Not because he won the game, but because he stopped playing it. So what made Carl Jung the man women couldn't control? It wasn't defiance. It wasn't arrogance. It was mastery. Quiet, internal, unshakable mastery. He didn't rage against control. He dissolved the hooks that made it possible. He understood the unconscious forces that move most men like puppets, and he cut the strings. While others lived to be seen, chosen, loved, he lived to know, to awaken, to become. He walked through the fire of his own mind and came out with nothing left to prove. That is why no one, not society, not seduction, not even love itself, could hold him hostage. And in a world addicted to attention, Jung reminds us that the greatest power is to no longer need it.